Have you ever felt like your synth sounds just suck and you can't come up with anything interesting? Have you ever wished that someone would just give you 7 great ideas to get some life-changing patches going? And ideally, the video wouldn't be an hour long.
Less than an hour. Right. Yep. You know me, Bo. All about those short videos.
Today's synth exploration is sponsored by DistroKid, so if you want to release your music onto Spotify, iTunes and other great stores, use DistroKid and my link in the description for a discount. DistroKid costs $20 a year, and with that you can upload unlimited amounts of music to all the stores. Let's talk envelopes. Envelopes are tight, but I've heard that inverted envelopes are even tighter.
So we're all on equal footings before we get going. Let's just talk about what we mean by an envelope. An envelope is one of our modulation sources. And a modulation source is just a fancy way of saying something which will automatically wiggle a knob for us so that we don't have to do it with our hands. The other most common kind of modulation source we have is the LFO, which is going to push a knob up and down, up and down, up and down in a cyclic fashion. So for example, what's happening with the pitch there, it's going up and down, up and down. Whereas an envelope is all about a journey. So our knob starts at a particular point, and when we press a key, it's going to go on a journey. Generally speaking, it's going to go up, go down to a particular point. It's going to hold at that point until we let go of our key, and then it's going to turn back down like that. That's a sort of a manual representation of probably the most common type of envelope, which is an ADSR, an attack, decay, sustain, release envelope. Now, in describing an envelope there, I did something subtle that I think is reinforcing a particular prejudice that there is around envelopes. What I described is essentially this shape here. I pressed the key, the cutoff in this case swept up, it went down for a little bit, it held a particular point, and then when I release the key, it goes down like that. So if I wanted to set this up here, we'd have the attack somewhere like this, the decay about the same, sustain most of the way up, and then the release fairly long like that. And then we should get a sound which sort of follows this shape. If we turn our cutoff down, turn the amount of the envelope up, we'll get something like holding here, and then I let go of the key, and down it goes like that. Now, you may well have seen a drawing like this before. You've probably also heard this sound before, and it's all about going from a low point and then going up to a high point. That's basically the journey that we always think about on most envelopes, on most patches that we build, I think. But on most synths, or at least a very good number of synths, you don't have to go from low to high. You can actually invert that and go from high to low, and that's really what this particular tip is about. Inverting your envelopes is a great way to find a more complex sound without having to introduce any more complexity, really. What's interesting if you look at the shape of this envelope is that it's actually kind of a more complex thing. If we're starting high and then dropping down low like this, and this is our attack time, but this time it's taking us down rather than up, this is almost like what we would usually think of as a decay envelope. It's a kind of a plucky sound, right? There you go, ding. And then it's going to automatically swoop back up and hold at a particular point. And then when you let go of the note, it's going to blossom back up. And this is a really, really lovely sound. And as I say, it's probably there for free on a number of synths that you may already own. So let's look at setting this particular shape up. The shape itself is actually the same as what we already had set up on the normal way that we would do it. All we need to do here really is come over to our envelope generator intensity here, the EG int knob here. If it's at 0, then it's applying nothing. If it's positive, it's going to be moving the envelope up. And then if we go negative, it's going to go the other way instead. So we're going to want to start bright this time and let it go down. And we should hear something like this shape is describing. A pluck, and a swoop back up. It's going to hold at a particular point. That point is going to be defined by the sustain knob. And actually, if you want it to be coming further up, you probably want to turn the sustain down. So we got a pluck, swoop up, then a longer swoop up at the end there. If we want it to be more plucky, we can turn our attack down. If we want that swoop back up to be slower, we can turn our decay up. So you kind of get this thing where the notes return after a little while. And then blossom out at the end there. If we want that initial pluck to be more rounded, we can turn our attack up. So we can have more of a sort of a... And here they come back. And then this G is going to come back later. Swooping back in now. It's somehow a much more complex shape that's being described here. But it really isn't. All we have done is turned that envelope upside down, and we've gained a whole new way of describing these sounds. And that's a wonderful thing.
Now let's talk noise. I use noise to spice up my drum sounds sometimes, to make cool percussive noises, but maybe there's some life-changing tip in there when it comes to noise.
So I guess this isn't so much a tip as it is me advocating for you to use noise in more of your patches. In a general sense, when we think about audio circuits, noise is usually seen as an unfavorable thing, something that you want to actually avoid, almost like a mistake. You don't want like a preamp with a high noise floor, for example. But a great number of synths allow us to mix noise into our sounds. So why would we want to do that? So we've got a noise control here on the Minilogue, and yeah, we can make wind noises if we want. And if we set, for example, a nice snappy envelope like this, we can use noise to create sort of percussive sounds. Obviously, we want to make a hi-hat sound. That's a great way of doing it. But what I want to talk about in particular here more is mixing noise into our sort of melodic patches. So to introduce this, I want to maybe start with one of my all-time favorite kinds of patches. And you can do this on any synth which has a noise source, a filter which where you can sort of crank the resonance up fairly high, and crucially a filter which has key tracking so that the cutoff will follow the keyboard. So I'll just set my cutoff down a little bit here, and I'll turn my resonance up, open my envelope back up as well. So we've got this sound here now, which is my noise bumping into the resonance of the filter. And if we turn on key tracking now, we should be able to play this. Beautiful, sort of ghostly, fragile sound. Let's give it some delay. Yeah, and the cutoff is going to change the tuning of this. So that's just a lovely sound, I think. Let's just have a listen to one of those notes and just try and work out what makes it so lovely. So if we just hold this down, we can hear that resonating filter, which would normally just be a sine wave, but because we have that noise bumping into it, that resonance is constantly sort of moving and burbling. And certainly on the lower notes, we can't so much hear the noise, but we can hear it sort of moving our sound around. It makes it very alive. And you can take this basic principle that we've created here and sort of mix it into other sounds. So I'm just going to turn the resonance down a little bit and turn one of our filters, one of our oscillators back up. Maybe turn off key tracking for a minute. And at the moment we can hear the noise sat alongside our sort of melodic sound. We can go back to that side, kind of wind sound. So let's turn that noise down to the point where we can sort of still kind of hear it, but it's sort of just barely perceptible. So around sort of there. It's not totally obvious that there's noise mixed in anymore. But watch what happens if we turn that noise off now. The patch is so much less alive and interesting, so much less movement. It certainly works more easily with darker sounds. Bring in the other oscillator, turn that delay back up. And even now, with all of those other things contributing to that movement, if we take the noise out, everything's so much more static. With noise, and without noise. So just mixing in noise at an almost imperceptible level can just bring so much life to a patch. And that is why I'm advocating for you to turn up that noise knob on more of your patches.
Do you have any ideas or tips on how to get started making an FM patch?
So FM is this wonderful world of sound. It's so flexible, so many sounds to uncover. It's one of my favorite forms of synthesis. But I think sometimes it's not always straightforward to go from a sound in your head to what that means in terms of the various parameters on the synth. But there are sort of these three-ish principles that if you sort of stick with, that will get you started in most cases. As many of you probably already know, in FM, classic FM, you have these things called operators. They're not magic, they are just essentially oscillators with an amp envelope. And these operators can do one of two different jobs. We have the carriers, those are the things that we hear, and we have the modulators, which basically wiggle the carriers really, really fast, which changes the sound of the carrier. So on this patch here, I have operator 1 set up as a carrier. It's turned down at the moment, so we don't hear anything. If we turn it up, we can hear a sine wave. In this patch, operator 2 is acting as a modulator for operator 1. Because it's turned down at the moment, we are getting a pure sine wave, but as we turn operator 2 up, we get more harmonic richness. So that's kind of principle number one. If you have more modulator going into your carrier, that means you're going to get more richness to the sound. Now, because these are operators and not just oscillators, we have a amp envelope for this operator here. So we could change the shape of our envelope to get kind of paddy swells by giving it a longer attack. Or we could go plucky by shortening our attack, bringing our sustain down. And if we turn down the overall level, that's going to turn down the sort of maximum richness. That we hear, of course. This would be a great thing to modulate using our velocity as well. So the relative level of an operator is going to give us more harmonic content. The next thing that we can alter on a particular operator is the frequency relationship. So at the moment, operator 1 and operator 2 are at the same frequency. If we change the frequency of operator 2 maybe to double, what we call ratio now of 1 to 2, we get a different kind of sound. If we go to 4, again, a different kind of sound. If we half it, again, a different kind of sound. All of those ratios that I just chose there, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 4, those are fairly simple relationships, and the sounds that we got were fairly harmonious sounds. If we choose something slightly more complex, like 7 to 1, you can hear that things are maybe a little less harmonious. There are some overtones there which are not so straightforward for us to parse. If we come into the pitch here and maybe change the fine frequency adjustment on operator 2 and maybe go something like 1 to 1.38, we can hear that things are not as straightforward and harmonious. Goodness me. So here is principle number 2. Simple frequency relationships between the operators give harmonious sounds, whereas complex relationships between them are going to give us discordant, clangorous, atonal, bell-like sounds. So for the third principle, again, we're going to think about the frequency relationships between our carrier and modulator. So I've come back to a one-to-one relationship here. And as I turn up the level of our modulator, it very much sounds like we are altering the timbre of our carrier. It almost sort of sounds like we're opening up a filter in a way. It all sounds like it's kind of one coherent, integrated sound. Now, if we change the ratio of operator 2 to, say, 10, which is still a simple relationship, but it's a relationship where the operators are much further apart in frequency relationship. We're still getting harmonious sounds, but rather than it sounding like it's opening a filter, it kind of feels like we're mixing in another sound over the top almost. So when our frequency relationships are close, the sounds are integrated. And when they are far apart, it sounds more as if we are bringing in distinct overtones over the top of our sound. Kind of those glassy sounds that FM's often known for. And of course, if we then combine those last two principles together, we can get something where we have sort of discordant. So we choose something that's a weird relationship, but far away. And we get these sort of clangorous overtones which sort of sit over the top of our fundamental. So in terms of principle 3, close frequency relationships give us integrated sounds, and distant frequency relationships are going to give us these sort of overtones that sit over the top of our fundamental. And we can combine those ideas all together to get more complex sounds. So operator 3 here actually has operator 4, 5 and 6 all running into it as its modulators, and we can set them to use each of those different principles to get a more complex sound. So operator 4, for example, we could bring up and maybe have its relationship maybe just like a 2-to-1, something simple and integrated. And then we could bring up operator 5 a little bit and maybe choose something that's a bit more complex to get some of that sort of bell-like overtone over the top of it. And then we bring up operator 6, and perhaps we want to get some of that sort of sparkly, glassy stuff going over the top here, so we can set its ratio far away, maybe a little bit more clangy. And then if we came in, we could change how those envelopes all work with it. Maybe we could have this one sweep in a little bit. So we get a whop at the top. Make our carrier a bit longer. And we can sort of get to this point where we are combining those different principles to get to various different sounds that we have in our head.
Before we move on with the video, I just want to mention our Summer of Synths sponsor, DistroKid. So if the Summer of Synths videos have inspired you to create some music and you want to release it, you should use DistroKid. They're very quick to get the music onto stores, and it only costs $20 a year, and you can upload unlimited amounts to all the relevant stores like Spotify, iTunes. We got Amazon Music, we got Tidal. It's also super easy to collaborate using DistroKid, so if you are working on music with other people and you need to share the revenue between each other, it's super easy to set up. You basically just insert the emails of the people that you're working with, and it's pretty much that simple, and then they get a cut of whatever revenue you're making from your music. So definitely check out DistroKid. I've linked them down below. If you use the link, you support Summer of Synths and you get a discount. Thank you so much, DistroKid, for all the years of supporting Bobeats, and thank you for supporting Summer of Synths. Lo-fi sounds, they're so hot right now, but I feel like I need something fresh to impress my hipster friends. Do you got something for me, Oscillator?
I think it's safe to say that we live in a golden age of synths. Never before have options been so plentiful, powerful, and affordable. We have high-resolution digital synths and stable self-tuning analog. And yet, most of us still have a soft spot for synths from a bygone age, even if those instruments are now technically inferior, awkward, finicky, or even in a state of disrepair. And we even often view these through this rose-tinted lens of cassette tapes, VHS, and vinyl. Low fidelity was once a criticism, but now it's just a vibe. And it's one that I am totally here for. So let's talk about some shortcuts to that vibe by emulating a synth which has seen many years of use, but maybe not years of maintenance. So I just got this pad sound here, and I've chosen the OPsix because obviously it's a digital synth, which is going to be very precise to begin with. So destabilizing it to make it sound like a more broken down analog synth is obviously going to be a more interesting challenge. So there are kind of two things that I like to think about when I'm trying to create these sort of broken down synth sounds. And they are sort of creating instability within the parameters and emulating the output of the synth, which has maybe started to degrade a little bit and therefore become a bit crunchy and band limited. So in terms of creating instability, our sort of number one friend is going to be a synth where we have a LFO type, which is smooth random. Thankfully, on a lot of synths these days, this is a particular option. So I'm going to choose one of these smooth random LFOs here on LFO 1. And we don't want this to sound like an LFO that's moving around. What we want to emulate here is that different voices within the synth potentially are sort of not quite calibrated right or shifting around a little bit. So we don't want this to be running at a speed that we can really hear it moving. We want it to be going pretty slowly. Something like this. Okay, so currently that LFO isn't going anywhere. The really obvious place to send it and the place that gets you sort of immediate vibe would be sending it to the pitch. So I'm going to come across to the pitch of the operator that we're actually hearing here. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of LFO depth, like not even a quarter of a tone, so maybe like 0.2, maybe not even that much. And immediately we get that vibe happening. That's a little bit much, a bit microtonal there. So we've gone from this sound, which is very stable, and we've introduced all of this interaction between the voices there. And it's not just a detune between the voices, because it is actually moving a little bit, and each voice will be starting in a different place. So you get this chaos to the sound, which is really, really appealing, because we don't like perfection when we hear it. So another place where we could send something like this that's maybe a little bit more subtle, but I think is really, really effective, and I'll just set up another random LFO there and just set it going slowly, is parts of our envelope, so that each note's envelope is a slightly different shape. So I'll just do this with the attack in this case. So I'm going to come into my mod matrix here. The destination is going to be the attack envelope of this operator because of the way I have this particular patch set up. But on another synth, you would just send it to the attack of your amp envelope, for example. And yeah, I'll just give it a bit of depth and make sure we set that to our LFO 2 it was, something like that amount of depth would be nice. And we should hear that each note just comes on slightly differently. It just has this sort of interest to the sound. And you can continue to try and add this kind of instability in your patch to build up this sort of broken circuitness. So in terms of thinking about the sort of more worn out output part of the synth, an obvious thing would be if you have the filters to make it darker. That's a good start. And immediately the synth starts to sound older. But one thing I would not overlook if you have the option, everyone always gravitates towards low pass filters. It's kind of the default filter type, but I'm of the opinion that band pass filters are magic, especially when you're trying to emulate this kind of sound. So let's come across to a band pass. This one here will do. And let's just find a place where it's comfortable. Give it a bit of resonance to make things a bit weird, a bit honky and vocal. And we'll just boost the output here just to compensate. We're very lo-fi now, but if we think about how we could have this fitting in with other bigger sounds, this now becomes a vibe that's interesting. This synth has seen better days. Another place that we can add this sort of degraded output would be to add a little bit of distortion to it as well. Not distortion that you can really hear, obviously, but just a tiny little bit of crunch on the output. So that's far too much. So we'll turn the drive all the way down. Of course, you could do this with the distortion pedal or with a plugin. I just happen to have distortion as an effect on the OPsix. I just want to hear a little bit of crunch. And then to finish this off, we might also put some chorus on it. That's got nothing to do with making it sound broken, but it's got everything to do with the vibe of this sort of patch, I think. Just that lovely little bit of crunch when you bring in additional notes. Is very, very pleasing. So we've gone to this point from what started out being a very probably boring single oscillator polysynth patch. Very vibey.
Let's talk effects, and more specifically reverb. I usually just slap some reverb on a patch when it's done to just making it sound more fat and big, but maybe there's something else I should be doing with my reverbs.
Well, I'm as guilty as anyone, probably more guilty than a lot of people, of creating a patch and then sticking a nice big reverb on the end of it to make it sound epic. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that reverb, digital reverb generators are generating a lot of complex sound that's very dynamic, often with lots of stereo movement. So it's actually a really good sound source to then process further, either with more effects or if you're in a modular environment with things even like filters. So here's an example. Here's a really, really simple patch that's just a sine wave through an envelope. Cool. So let's put some reverb on it. Immediately it's going to sound better because reverb makes everything better. I mean, lovely. But let's take that further and let's actually crank that reverb to 100% wet. So all we are hearing now is the reverb. And that's a really interesting signal to process further. It's very dynamic, it's got lots of stereo space within it. So let's take that and run it through something that is very sensitive to dynamics. So for example, a bit crusher. So let's turn this bit crusher on, just turn everything up to full. So that's basically our original signal. If we bring that bit reduction in, so it starts to fizz around in stereo. Was creating like a seaside around our sound. Maybe bring that sample rate reduction down. Get some of that glassy dampening to take the top end away. So much movement. And we've still got another FX slot here on the OPsix, so let's maybe put a filter on there. Maybe a nice slow resonant filter. We're barely touching our original sound. All of that tail there is coming from the reverb. So don't overlook reverb as being a sound source rather than an effect, because you can find these beautiful timbres, or indeed we can make things really, really nasty, but still strangely beautiful. Distortion works well as well. Anything that likes that movement in the dynamics. Ideally, you're going to want stereo effects, the way that the reverb crumbles in the different ears. Fantastic. Cool.
Even with all of these tips, I still feel like my patch is kind of stale and boring, but maybe velocity can help me bring it to life and take it to the next level.
So when it comes to velocity, there are basically two places where we almost always end up sending our velocity information to make our patches more responsive to our playing. The first and most obvious is that we want to send the velocity to the amp or volume of our patch, which means that when we play hard, we get a loud sound. And when we play softer, we get a quieter sound, which is going to be replicating kind of what we find in an acoustic instrument. The other place which is kind of similar to that, and arguably more interesting, is sending the velocity to the filter or the envelope for the filter potentially. So here, if I turn this up here, and I'll just darken the filter a little bit, when I play lightly, we get a duller sound. And when I play harder, we get a brighter sound. So the velocity is opening up the filter more, which again essentially is emulating something that we find in the acoustic world, because if you think about striking a guitar string or playing a piano, when you do play it harder, it does get brighter, generally speaking. That being said, we shouldn't be constrained to thinking about the acoustic world when we're dealing with synths, because they're not acoustic. And with a number of synths available today having potentially quite complex mod matrix capability, where we can be routing velocity to a lot of different places, I think it behooves us to think a little bit wider than that. So I'm going to give you 3 examples that I particularly like for sending velocity to, in the hope that you can try them and maybe find other new and interesting places to be sending your velocity, not just making things louder. I'll start with the one that I use most often. I think this works better on stuff which has a shorter or instant attack to the sound, but it works fairly well on pads as well. And this is to be sending velocity to the attack of the amp envelope. And what this does is gives us an alternative or a complementary mapping to the usual louder, softer, because we can use this to make harder notes actually attack harder and lighter notes be a little bit more sort of tubby and rounded. So what you want to do here is start with your amp envelope attack a little bit longer and tubby like that. So we've lost that click at the start of our note there. And what I'm going to do is create a mapping between that knob there, the attack, and velocity, like so. And we're going to set it up with a negative intensity, which means that when I strike harder and we have a higher velocity, it's going to lower the attack time. So I'll turn this down a whole bunch. We can go quite a long way down here. And what we should find now is that when I play lightly, we should still have that sort of tubby attack, like that. And now when I play hard, we should have more of a clicky instant attack, like so. And as I say, pairing that with the velocity on the amp a little bit as well can make for something that's a little bit more interesting than it just getting louder and quieter. So I'll leave that little bit of velocity on the amp there actually, because I think it will work nicely with this next one. And I'll come back into my mod matrix here and I will, let's just delete that mapping for now. So we're just back to, and we'll go back to clicky as well. And just a little bit of loudness variation there. So this next one I think is really lovely, and there's a bit of a balancing act of getting this working well with our sort of amp velocity amount, and that is to be making quiet notes more reverberant, essentially sending them back in the space. So what we want to do here is map, if we come into our reverb mount here, how much of our sound is going into the reverb versus the velocity. So on the Modwave, this is going to be the amount of send. On other synths, this might be mapping it to the wet-dry mix, for example, with quieter sounds being wetter. So let's, again, create another mapping here. So I'll say I want to create a mapping. It will be the wet-dry, or rather the send in this case, and again go with velocity here. And what we're going to want to do before we get going here is come into our reverb and just really make it very, very wet. Like so. In fact, let's go even further and let's also make it much longer as well. Let's get nice and ambient. Right, so coming back into my mod matrix here, what I'm going to do again is apply a negative amount so that the harder I hit, the less goes into the reverb. So maybe if I go to -20, because that's more or less where we started. So now when I play a loud note, or play hard I should say, that note is up front, right in our face, and when I play softly, up front, in the background, up front, and in the background when I play lightly. And again, matching this with the amp velocity amount can really fine tune this, and perhaps we need to make it a little bit more extreme. Lovely stuff. This last one I really like for like lead sound, so I've brightened things up a little bit and switched to mono mode as well. And this one is sending velocity to the amount of a LFO, and in this case I'm going to go with the pitch LFO. So with a lead sound like this, it's always nice to get a nice bit of wobble like that, but we don't necessarily want that on all the time. Often we map this to the mod wheel, but the nice thing about using velocity instead is it frees up the mod wheel for a different form of expression. So we'll set the mount down like that, and we'll set up a mapping again between the intensity of that LFO and again the velocity. We'll set the maximum to what we just had it at, which was just under a semitone, I think. And now when I play lightly, we get minimal wobble, and if I play hard, which is a really nice way to express that kind of warbly sound, that vibrato. And as I say, frees up your mod wheel for something else potentially. Again, don't always use that for the same thing. The same way we shouldn't use velocity for the same thing every time.
Gates. Beside opening and closing things, are there some interesting ways to use it? Maybe there's something you could do with gate lengths, for example.
This tip is one that I like to use on kind of percussive patches. It doesn't have to be drum patches, but anything that has a percussive element to it. And it's a way that we can make use of our envelopes to make for a more responsive, dynamic playing surface, essentially. So I'm going to use the amp envelope for this, which is probably the obvious place to use it, but you don't have to use the amp envelope. You could use any other envelope, going to any other parameter, and you might get interesting results as well. But it's easiest here with the amp, so we'll stick with that. And for this, you'll need to have at least an ADSR envelope. An ADSR is kind of the minimum. Essentially, you need an envelope where the decay and release are separate things, basically. So that's the sound I'm starting with here. And to get kind of a percussive sound, the main recipe is that we have a more or less instant attack. And the important thing really is that our sustain goes down to 0, because when you strike, I'll use drum as an analogy here, so we strike a drum, it's going to decay down to silence. There's no way to hit a drum and sustain the note by holding your hand on it, I guess. So now we have this sound here, which is that sort of general sort of plucky percussive sound, right? Now at the moment I've got my decay and my release set to the same time, so the sound is kind of consistent no matter how I play the notes. But the idea with this tip is to emulate a particular property of percussion instruments, which is, and again, I'll use drum as an example. There are two sort of ways that we can strike a drum. The first is that we can strike it cleanly. So we hit the drum and our hand or stick comes straight off it. And that allows the skin of the drum to resonate freely, and we get a long decay on that. The other way, of course, is that I could strike the drum and hold my hand on it. And what that's going to do is kill the resonance of the skin of the drum, and we're going to get a much shorter, thunkier kind of sound. And that's what we're going to emulate here, and it's going to allow us to do the same sort of thing with the keyboard. And the way that we do this is by making use of different decay and releases. Our decay is going to act like our hand-on playing, and the release is going to be our clean strike. So what we want to do here essentially is make sure that our decay is significantly shorter than the release. How you fine tune this will depend on your envelopes, but I'm going to start around there perhaps. I'll maybe leave the release where it is, maybe just a little bit longer. So now when I play a note and I keep my finger on the key, we get that kind of plucky sound. So what's happening here is that as long as I've got my finger on the key, there is a gate, and while there is a gate, the decay is the movement in the envelope that we get. So because our decay is quite short, we get this plucky response while my finger is still on the key. If I play the keys cleanly and lift my fingers off as soon as possible, we can now get that longer kind of response. And by fine-tuning the difference between the decay and the release, we can get different responses. So the reason this works is that because there's no longer a gate, because my fingers are no longer on the keys, we switch to our release period in our envelope, which is much, much longer. And there'll be nuances depending on how you've set this envelope up over sort of very quickly removing the finger, and I'll try to do it. Yeah, so like that, where I was still sort of holding on for a little bit longer, and then we had the resonance at the end. And it makes for a really, really lovely, expressive way of playing, where we can bring out lots of different nuances. This is quite an extreme example, but you kind of get the feel there. A lovely way to get additional expressiveness out of a keyboard playing surface just by massaging the envelope there.
Thank you so much, OscillatorSink, for all the great tips, and thank you for not making the video an hour long. So go and check out OscillatorSink, link down in the description. Also check out this year's Summer of Synths sponsor, DistroKid. They've helped us out making this event a reality. So go and check it out, linked in the description. Have a great day, talk to you later.